This is Charlie Pellerin. I hope this session is particularly interesting to you. I'm going to talk to you about the Hubble Space Telescope and my experiences around it. It launched in April 1990 and soon discovered it had the flawed mirror, and that adventure, I think, is probably fun. It's interesting, I never told the story about what happened with Hubble to anybody, never thought it was interesting until I was on a bike ride, a week-long bike ride for the White Rim Trail in Moab, Utah. It's an incredible experience. You bike, takes a week, you bike between two mountains, the Green and the Colorado River, looking down into these valleys, incredible thing. And so the first night, there were about 6 or 8 of us, and most of us didn't know each other, so people asked me to tell a story. So first time ever, I told the story about me and Barbara Mikulski and Hubble Space Telescope, and it seemed to be interesting to folks. I didn't think much about it until a week later. The ride ended and some new people came, and everybody unanimously wanted me to tell that story again. So I thought this must be interesting to folks, so I began to share it. So that's what I'm going to talk about here, among other things, a little more detail about the telescope and my experiences with it, and hope you find this lots of fun. So there it is. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's about the size of a school bus. It's got these antennas here for sending the science data back to Earth. They actually go up to geostationary satellites NASA owns first, then back down to Earth. These are the solar arrays which power it. They've been replaced a couple times. Instruments are all back here. This is the aperture cover that you can use to protect the telescope in a safe mode. It cannot look at things as bright as the Earth. The instruments are all back here. There's 8 of them. And let me see, not too many other details. It's wrapped in MLI, which is a multi-layer kind of I think it's capped on plastic with silvered aluminum on it to keep it thermally stable. And it's actually biased cold, and heaters inside, lots of them like thermostatic heaters like you might have in a simple version, might be in a fish tank, hundreds of them. And so, but the basic issue I'll talk about later is the pointing stability. So finally, the launch day came in April 1990, as I mentioned. And normally, I go into the VIP stands because the payloads are normally turned off during launch. And this is the blockhouse where they manage the launch of the shuttle. It's got dozens of people in here, also connected in with people in Houston. And the very complex preparations are all done in that building. For the Hubble launch, I was asked to come and sit in the building and with a headset on, and it had a screen like this, and I was on the management loop. And I was there for one very specific reason. If we had something go wrong in the ascent phase of the shuttle, somebody would have to make the really difficult decision of what to do with Hubble. And there were basically 2 choices. You could deploy Hubble into a low Earth orbit and plan to get back there with a second shuttle launch, which is problematic in many ways. The shuttle is very weather dependent, but weather in many places, and reboost it, or could leave it in the cargo bay and go to the secondary launch site. I think the most likely one was the one in Dakar, and that was not very well environmentally controlled. So the telescope would almost certainly be contaminated with dirt, which means take it apart. It was not designed to be disassembled. 5-year process, very complex. So 2 bad choices. Someone had to do it, and the powers that be decided it would be me. So I made a little table and had it on my lap. And I'm sitting with my headset, getting ready to make this terrible decision. We finally launched, and thank God everything went well. The only really bad part of this was to be qualified to sit in the blockhouse, I had to sit through simulations, which means you experience over and over and over all the things that go wrong. And one of the more stressful things I've ever done. So after the launch, I got on a shuttle training aircraft. This is the things they use to train the astronauts to land. It's basically a Gulfstream 3. And when the astronauts are training, they land with full reverse engines had to get this very steep angle and practice that, but they flew it like an ordinary airplane. I went to mission control at Houston, and this is what it looks like. I'm sure you've seen pictures of it. Uh, the I was not on the floor. I was not trained to be on the floor. I was up in a little VIP room in the back overlooking this, and I had technical people behind the scenes in other rooms called breakout rooms, and they were coming to talk to me about what was happening technically, and other senior industry presidents and other senior NASA managers were there with me. So we had a really scary time. The solar arrays, which were provided by ESA and were frankly not very good quality, and I knew this and tried to get them repaired before launch, and I didn't have the political wheelbase to do it. So they stuck coming out, caused a lot of angst. But finally, the JSC team was very well trained, and the payload operations people and my folks in the back room, they overrode the software limits. Solar arrays came out. We turned on the main flight computer and attitude control system. Everything worked. So the space shuttle let go of the arm. That's how it's held during the deployment. And the space shuttle went back to Earth and Hubble's in orbit. So everything looked good. About 6 weeks later, I went out to the Operations Control Center for Hubble, which is at another NASA center, one near headquarters, Goddard Space Flight Center. And that's what it looked like at the time, if you can believe that. So we all prepared for the first light image. I had wanted to do this in private, but my boss at the time, Lynn Fisk, had under pressure at a press conference agreed to do it in public. So that's what we did. And so we sat there, and for the first time, the first image appeared. This was with the wide field camera, the one that takes all the beautiful photographs that are so popular with everybody. And these images came on the screen, and everybody cheered. And I wondered why, because I said, these things look kind of blurry to me. So I had my chief system engineer next to me, great guy named Gene Oliver. I said, Gene, what's going on? He said, oh, Charlie, don't worry. We biased the secondary mirror a little bit out because we weren't sure how the carbon epoxy truss that holds it would change outgassing in space. And so if we were out of focus, we knew which way to drive the secondary mirror. This was so we didn't have to hunt back and forth. It's a simple adjustment. It's no problem at all. So I'm greatly relieved. So about a week later, I'm feeling exhausted. The stress of Hubble, all the preparations in the blockhouse and everything, I needed a break. And one of the things that I like to do was go to Japan. I always have loved to go there. And I had lots of international agreements with the Japanese government and good close relationships. And they know that what I enjoyed most was going to a Japanese inn called a ryokan. And this is what they're like. You have a tatami mat floor and a table in the middle. Your beds and futons over here in a cabinet. They always have a little nice view. That's what the service looks like. And it usually includes a meal, and that's a Japanese kaiseki meal, best food in the world, many tastes. This is very typical high-end Japanese food. And so I went to my boss at the time and I said, Lynn, I'm going to Japan for a week. That's okay with you. And I'm going to be out of touch. I'll have my pager. In those days, cell phones were rare, but we had these pagers. And so I have my pager on me, but I'm going to be hopefully in a ryokan. And the Japanese know that I like best to be in one that's never had a foreigner before. So probably if it even has a phone, I don't have any way how to call you. So I'll be out of touch for a week. Is that okay? And Lynn's being the nice guy he was, he said, sure, that's fine. What can I do for you? So I said, I'm glad you asked. There's going to be medals in the Rose Garden for Hubble. And I would like you to make sure that President Bush puts my medal on me and not Vice President Quayle. So that was kind of a joke, and we laughed a little, and off I go. So I'm gone for a week. I come back and I land in St. Louis Airport Lounge, red carpet lounge, waiting for my flight to Washington. So I decide to call headquarters and see what's going on. So I called my secretary and she said, where are you? I told her. She said, have you talked to Dr. Fisk lately? I said, no. She said, I'll put you right through. So I thought this is kind of interesting. When you call a senior executive at NASA or anywhere, they typically spend their whole day in meetings. And so it'd be very rare that they can just pick up the phone. So while I'm waiting for a few seconds for him to pick up the transfer, I'm thinking, what could this be about that's so important? Maybe it's about the rose garden. So I'm kind of internally smiling. And he says, Charlie, where are you? And I said, I'm in St. Louis Airport. And he said, great. What do you know about spherical aberration? And I said, well, what I know is that when amateurs build telescope mirrors and they do it sloppily, they get what's called the downturn edge. And what that means is that light reflects from different points on the mirror, reflected from different points along the mirror, focuses on different places on the optical axis, so the telescope can never be focused. So he said, I'm glad you know about that because you launched Hubble Space Telescope with a flawed mirror. And this is two PhDs. I said, did not. He said, did so, did not, did so. After a few rounds of that, he said, stop, go pick up the front page of any national newspaper and bring it here to the telephone. This is a true story. He said, read to me what it says above the fold. And this is national disaster. Hubble launched with flawed mirror. He said, now what do you say? And I said, how did you guys put a fake newspaper in this lounge? So denial is a real phenomenon. He said, when are you going to be back to work? I said, I can be back tomorrow morning. He said, okay, I want you in my office at 7 a.m. That was kind of unusual also. We usually didn't come to work till 8. So I walk in 7 a.m. and all of top management sitting in his conference room and they're all mad at me. And the question is, how'd you let this happen? Well, I have no idea what happened. He said, okay, come into my office. He said, Congress is going to name a failure review board and probably give us a lawyer for chairman. We don't want that. So he said, how about if we pick our own failure review board? And I said, great idea. He said, I'd like to name Lou Allen. He's director of JPL. Lou was a 4-star general at the Air Force previously, but at this time he's a civilian. I just couldn't find another photograph of him. I was very fond of him. He's a decent, honest, smart guy. I said that would be super. So Lou decided to gather a suite of experts, and he was very clear. He said, we're not looking for who to blame because he knew if that was our intent, there'd be a cover up. So we just want to find out what happened. So we went to Danbury, Connecticut. I was named as liaison to the failure review board because I was at this kind of middle point of having a lot of political visibility, but at the same time, a lot of technical knowledge and background. And so we spent 3 days and nobody knew what happened. So I come back to Washington and get a phone call from the administrator's office, Dick Truly, and said, Barbara Mikulski would like to meet you and the administrator in her office tomorrow at 10. And it wasn't a question. When she asked, we go. So I walked in there and she's mad as hell at me. Now, the reason was that she had asked me about a year before, will it work? So what would you say? Would you say, I hope so? And would you say it might work? Would you say, gee, it'd be nice if it worked? No, there's only one answer. Of course it's going to work. And she became decided from that conversation to become very closely politically connected to the telescope. So when it didn't work, it looked bad for her. So she was angry. And the truth is, I really didn't know for sure, as there was a key specification that we could not test. You know, when we build space systems, we like to test everything on the ground because once they're gone, you can't do much to them. Hubble was an exception. We could repair it in principle. But here was the thing. If you go out to a dark place and a clear sky and look up, you'll see the stars. And the stars will likely be twinkling. You might think the stars are changing, but they're not. What's happening is the variations in air density are refracting the light, and they're causing it to move around in space when you get close to the ground. So what's happening with your eye is the light is switching on and off of your retina. That's what's causing the twinkling effect. And so if you put a detector on the ground, you get a very low signal to noise ratio. You get kind of a hazy gray blob, which is not good for doing scientific things. That's the reason Hubble went to space. So for Hubble went above the atmosphere to solve this problem. Hubble is basically a contrast machine. And you surely know that if you take a photograph with your camera, any camera, you've got to hold it stable to get a clear image. Well, the same thing is true for Hubble. It has to be held very stably. And what we wanted to do was get maximum performance of Hubble, which means, I'm going to use a technical term here, have it operate at the diffraction limit in the ultraviolet. That means the best you can do from a physical point of view. So to do that, the Hubble would have to be stable with a stability of 7,000ths of an arc second for 24 hours at a time. Now, you probably don't think about these units very often, so let me put it into simpler terms for you. That's the angle that a pearl, 10 millimeter pearl, would make at a distance of 350 kilometers. I think you can see this is an incredibly difficult thing to do, and not just stable in a very specific direction. Now, when you do that, instead of this kind of blurry gray image, you get this wonderful signal to noise ratio like this. And Hubble was designed to move us from basically 2200 vision as a metaphor for which is legally blind to 20/20 vision. What's interesting about this is if we fail to meet this specification by even a factor of 10, we still might have built the most stably pointed thing ever made by anybody, but it would have been useless to meet our design specification. So in the conversation, she's mad, so she puts her finger in my chest and says to me, Charlie, there'll never be an appropriated dollar to fix this telescope. This is a nightmare that has to go away. This was the blamer state, and I'll describe this at some length as we go along. We got in the car, and the administrator truly, he's a very nice man. I'm very fond of him. I couldn't find a picture of him looking angry, so I've made this photograph of him with this overlay. We got in his car. He said, Charlie, you heard the congresswoman. Yes, sir. So I go back to my office, and fortunately, I had been trained in somatic psychology as a sideline thing just for personal interest. And one of the things I was taught to do was to pay attention to your emotional state. Basically, as I'll show you more later, emotions are body sensations that your mind interprets as emotions. And the question is, you feel lousy, and lousy is kind of a mixture of mad, sad, and scared, and I felt lousy. When that happens, you're almost certainly in a drama state, and there are four. I'll explain that more later too. But the remedy is to breathe into these, best thing I know, belly breathe, which is the same way singers and prime athletes breathe using your diaphragm. This mitigates the emotions, and now you can look at the thoughts powering them. And what were the thoughts, which I call storylines, powering them? I cannot act because the Congress and the NASA administrator have forbidden it. This is a state of victim, a place of helplessness. I can't do anything. So the question for me is always, what's the right thing to do? And I think the deeper question is whose interests are being served. If this was only to save me, it would not be the right thing to do. And it wasn't. It was about the community, the science, the people involved, the agency, the country, everybody else. So I decided I'm going to commit myself to fixing the telescope. Now, what's interesting about this is that at the time, despite a lot of work, we had about 3 weeks of work now by really smart people, there was no technical concept. It looked impossible. So I proceeded anyway. I will fix the telescope and 100% committed to finding a way. So in the next section, I'll tell you what I did next. I hope this is interesting to you. It was a big adventure for me. And if you like this, I've been asked by my friends to urge you to subscribe to my channel. I'm not sure what it does except gets more people interested, which is be fun for me. And thank you for paying attention, and we'll continue the journey in the next episode, episode 10, about how I dealt with this mess. Thank you again, and much appreciated. Be safe.